board before Shabbat on top of the olives and the grapes, which will hasten the process, which will quicken up the process of the liquid to come out from the grapes and the olives. You're not doing it on Shabbat, you're doing it before Shabbat. And even though Beit Shammai holds that your utensils can't be working for you on Shabbat, they can't do work for you, but this is not called a biblical work for you because the juice is coming out anyways without your utensil, without the help of the beam that you placed on the olives and the grapes. The juice would come out anyways, maybe at a slower rate. So the Gemara says, good morning, Levi. So the Gemara said that that's not called the malacha d'oraita. That's not the biblical prohibition of threshing. We said on Shabbat, one of the third nine malachas is threshing, right? You can't go ahead and remove the product from its from where it's being held. You can't remove eloquently the way they express it over here is that when you go ahead and you take a threshing you take the edible part of a plant or the like from its natural moorings to the shell in which it grows. And when you just like when you loosen the kernels of a grain from the husk, right? That's the model of threshing, right? How do you thresh something, right? You go ahead, you loosen the kernels of the grain from the husk. The ox threshes, on the grain. He's stepping on it, right? So he's loosening the kernels from the husk. So here, when you go ahead and if you squeeze the liquid out you take the grape and you squeeze the juice of the grape from the shell, so that's comparable to taking the kernel from the husk. And when the kernels are attached to the husk, they remain indistinct, and they're not a food. But when you loosen it and you take it out, that turns that into a food. So the same thing is with the juice of a grape and the juice of an olive. When they are in the olive, they're not distinct. You don't see the juice. You just see it's just like an olive. When you go ahead and you squeeze the olive, now you have separated, you have made it into a food. You have, in a sense, by separating it, now you see the juice. It becomes a food. It becomes edible. It becomes its own food, its own state. Different. Before it was a solid. Now it's a liquid. It's different. Before it wasn't juice. It was a grape. Now it's a juice. So the issue here with the olive and the grape that was crushed before Shabbat, and now you're just and it's the juice is already coming out, and you go ahead and if you would go ahead and you would actually squeeze it on Shabbat, the Gemara says that would not be the biblical prohibition. It would be rabbinically prohibited because it was coming out anyways. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara wants to know who was the author of that Mishnah. Who was the author that says that since it's going to come out anyways, the fact that you make it faster, it's not a biblical violation. So the Gemara now says, the Gemara had said before, there was a Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina who said it was Rabbi Yishmael. He found a Mishnah with the garlic and the unripened grapes that were crushed before Shabbat. And Rabbi Yishmael said that, and you put the way Rashi learns, you put a board on top of the unripened grapes or on top of the garlic, and it's fine. You can put the board before Shabbat, and it continuously goes ahead and draws out more liquid. It's fine. So the Gemara wants to show, so we see, because once it was crushed before Shabbat, the subsequent crushing would not be a biblical violation. So that's what the Gemara wants to say. Now the Gemara has a different source. Rabbi Elazar says it's he says it's Rabbi Elazar. The rabbi of our Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar. Nan, we learned in the Mishnah. Halot devash sheriskon the erev Shabbat. If you have a honeycomb and you went ahead and you crushed it, before Shabbat, right? So what's the case? Let's say you broke up a honeycomb before Shabbat. The honeycomb contains the honey, and you broke it before Shabbat. Now the honey will now come out from the honeycomb because you broke the honeycomb. As long as you didn't break the honeycomb, everything remains inside. Now you broke the honeycomb, so the honey is coming out. Now the question is, could you eat the honey that comes out on Shabbat from that honeycomb, right? You crushed it before Shabbat. Now we know if you went ahead and if liquid comes out of a grape or an olive on Shabbat, you can't use that liquid on Shabbat that came out from the olive and the grape, because we're afraid if you're going to use that liquid, you might come to squeeze the olive or the grape. And over here we say that since the honeycomb was crushed before Shabbat, so we have an opinion that says, first opinion says asur, that the honey that comes out on Shabbat, you can't eat it because we're afraid if you're going to eat this honey, you're going to come to crush the honeycomb. But the other opinion says, Rabbi Eliezer Matir. Rabbi Eliezer says that if you crush the honeycomb before Shabbat, and then it's oozing out, the honey is coming out from the honeycomb on Shabbat, you could eat it. It's not a problem. Now, why does he allow you to eat it? The honey is coming out on Shabbat from the honeycomb. So it would seem because once it was already crushed before Shabbat, now, even if, what are you afraid of? You're afraid, maybe I shouldn't allow you to eat the honey that comes out on Shabbat, because I'm going to allow you to eat the honey that comes out on Shabbat. I might actually squeeze the honeycomb to get out more honey. But even if I would squeeze the honeycomb to get out more honey, it would not be a violation of Shabbat, a Torah violation. Why not? Because since the honey is coming out anyways without my squeeze, so that would not be a biblical violation of squeezing on Shabbat. So we see from here that once something has been crushed and it's coming out by itself before Shabbat, even if I would quicken the pace by squeezing it subsequently on Shabbat, I wouldn't be violating the Shabbat. Is that clear, Ralph? Just to make it clear. If I take an olive or a grape on Shabbat and I
changing the component, once
I could change
a fruit to a juice.
Right. And I did this action of, if I squeeze it on Shabbat, the liquid was not coming out without my action. I now have separated the product, the food, from its husk, like the kernel from its husk, so to speak. So therefore, that would be a biblical violation. But what about if the grape was already crushed before Shabbat? And now I crush it, I continue the crushing process on Shabbat. So the question is that a biblical violation? So the Gemara wants to say there's an opinion that says it's not a biblical violation if I would do that, because if I would not have done the second crushing, it's already coming out without me, because I crushed it before Shabbat, and now that the juice is already set to come out without me, so we don't look at, I didn't really do a real job, a real malacha, when without my act, this was happening anyways without me. So it's not my, I didn't really do anything a real productive big act that you could say I did a biblical violation. I did this act when the act is happening without me. So that is the question, and the Gemara wants to say we have a proof from the honeycomb. We have the proof that Rabbi Lazar is of that opinion, because he says that honeycomb. Now, if you would go ahead and crush the honeycomb on Shabbat, that's a biblical violation because the honey is not, let's say, fit. It's not coming out from the honeycomb without you crushing it. And therefore, your act of crushing it would be the biblical violation. But if I crushed it already before Shabbat, the honey is coming. The honey is coming out without me doing any subsequent action. Now, if I would subsequently quicken the process by squeezing, breaking it, crushing it more, that would not be a biblical, according to Rabbi Lazar, that's not a biblical prohibition if I would have do that on Shabbat, because it would happen, that act, the purpose of that act to get out honey was happening without me because I already had crushed it before Shabbat. Being that's the case, that's why Rabbi Lazar does not make a rabbinic prohibition on the honey that oozed out from the honeycomb on Shabbat, which was crushed before Shabbat. Because once it was crushed before Shabbat, even if I would subsequently crush that honeycomb on Shabbat, that would not be a biblical prohibition, and therefore they don't feel the need to prohibit the honey that oozes out on Shabbat. In contrast to a grape or an olive which was not crushed before Shabbat, where the juice came out on Shabbat, you would forbade the juice because of preventing the biblical violation of squeezing a grape or an olive that was not crushed before Shabbat. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, my time lo'omak Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, that says that the Mishnah, our Mishnah is Rabbi Yishmael. He did not say lo'omak Rabbi Lazar. He did not say that it is Rabbi Lazar's opinion, as seems to be shown from the honeycomb. Why didn't he say that the Mishnah is Rabbi Lazar? What was compelling him? What was compelling him to say that the Mishnah is Rabbi Yishmael? So Amalach. So the Gemara says you can't compare the case of the honey in the honeycomb, to the case of our Mishnah. Why? Hatam, in the case of the honeycomb, the meikara ochel ubesof ochel. You know, when the honey is in the honeycomb, both in the beginning, when it was in the honeycomb, it's a food, and when it comes out, subsequently, when it's crushed, it's also a food. Even if you crush it, if you crushed it once and you crushed it twice, it's a food. So Rabbi Lazar holds that that's the case, perhaps, where the squeezing is not forbidden min Torah. There's no real change. And if there's no real change from where it was before to where it was afterwards, meaning once you crushed it the first time, and even before you crushed it, once you crushed it, it was a food. And then after you crushed it, it's still a food. So therefore, it did not really create a real change in the item. And therefore, maybe that's why it would not be a biblical prohibition once you crushed it. However, the Gemara says, but over here in our Mishnah, when we're dealing with olives and grapes, good morning, Asaf. Meikara ochel. It was originally a food. Even when you crushed it, after you crushed it the first time, right? It's a food. The olive and the grape, it's still considered a food after you crushed it. And then when you if you would squeeze it after you crushed it, now you're creating something new. You're changing its status from a solid to a liquid. So maybe, therefore, I have no proof that that would be allowed on Shabbat, meaning if I put the board on before Shabbat, after I crush the grapes, how do I know I could leave the board there and use that liquid on Shabbat? Maybe we should make a rabbinic fence not to use it because I might come to crush it on Shabbat. Even though it was already crushed before Shabbat, maybe that second crushing would be a biblical prohibition of dosh, of threshing on Shabbat, because I am affecting a very big change. I'm like creating I'm making it, turning in from a food into a liquid, just like we explained. When you have a grain and you have the husk and you have the kernel, it's not when it's in the before it's detached, it's not it doesn't have its own identity. It's not distinct when the kernel is in the husk, and now it becomes distinct, its own edible food. It's different. It's a big change. So too, maybe the liquid that's in the grape or the olive, maybe that's called a real change. So the Gemara says, now, just want to some explain what is the meaning of this, something that was a food before and a food afterwards. So the malacha, the act of work that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, which we call threshing, is the separation of a food from where it's attached to. The food, the kernel is attached to the husk, where it grew. When you separate the kernel from the husk, now you have created some new identity, something that was not recognizable before. The kernel was, when it's in the husk, it's not distinct. Only now, as a result of your separating, when you loosen the kernel from the husk, now that's a process. You've created something. You've like made it into a food. So that's what we're saying. The separating of the kernel from the husk causes that the kernel becomes like a food. As long as the kernel is attached to the husk, doesn't have its own identity, and it's not considered like a food. So too, the squeezing of the honeycomb, of the honey from the honeycomb, from the wax of the honeycomb, is a derivative of threshing. Why is it a derivative of threshing? Because it's the separation. Good morning, Ronnie.
Good morning.
We're focusing now on the malacha, on one of the 39 laws of Shabbat. You're not allowed to thresh. You're not allowed to separate the kernel from the husk. Correct, Mr. Haber? It's a real act. And we know the Torah says that, interesting, we can't do it. Torah says that you can't muzzle your ox while it's doing the work of threshing. The Torah says there's a prohibition. The Torah can't muzzle the ox. And what is the ox doing? It's separating the kernel from the husk, and that's something that we can't do on Shabbat. And the Gemara compares So the classic case is you take a grain, or an ear of wheat, or whatever it is, and whatever it is, and you separate the kernel, excuse me, from the husk. So too, the Gemara says, squeezing honey from a honeycomb, from the wax of the honeycomb, but the honey is like pockets of honey that are inside. And when you squeeze it out, that's also called a derivative of the act of threshing. Because when you separate the honey from the wax is like comparable to the husk. It's a The husk doesn't have it's the waste product, so to speak. So too, the separating of the honey from the wax of the honeycomb, that makes the honey into a food, or that makes the honey into a liquid that's recognizable. Beforehand, it's part of this honeycomb, like the kernels are part of the husk, and they don't have its own identity. You've created its identity. So too, the squeezing of olives and grapes is also a derivative. A toldo, we call it a child, a derivative of threshing, because the separating of the oil and the wine from, so to speak, from its shell, which is the grape, the olive, makes the juice, now the juice has its own identity. Did not have its own identity before because it was part of the grape, part of the shell of the grape, or part of what was contained inside the grape was contained inside the olive.
So are you saying that the corn, the cob of the corn, or are you talking about the cob or the husk that the corn comes in?
So we're talking about the husk.
The green husk.
Right. Well, let's say you have let's say you have certain an ear of wheat or something that has the seed inside. You got to get and the outside that contains it is it's just like a shell of something. It's just growing inside of it, and that's like the waste product.
But you're not talking about the cob. You're talking
No,
about
we're not talking about the corn of the cob.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Now, so the malacha, the act of threshing olives or grapes, is that it was originally a food, the olive and the grape, and now you have turned it. Now it was part, meaning the liquid was part of the food. It did not have its own identity as a liquid, and now you create it into a liquid, and that would be the act of malacha. Now, when you crush, however, after you crush the honeycomb, you already crushed the wax that contains the honey inside. The squeezing of the honey will not be considered a act of threshing on a Torah level, because the honey is recognized once you crush the honeycomb. Now you see now the honey. It's now, and that's called the food. Therefore, the subsequent crushing is not called an act of threshing, because once the wax was crushed, now there's the identity of the honey. And the honey is now, it's a food at that point. And now you only, now you brought the food to a different level, but it's a food. It's not that you went from a food to a liquid, or it's not that you went ahead and you took something that was not distinct and recognizable, now it becomes recognizable. It is already recognizable once you did the crushing. And therefore, being that's the case, if you did the crushing before Shabbat of the honeycomb, then subsequently you put the then afterwards you put the board on top of the honeycomb and of the crushed honey, and now it's coming out faster, the honey, or even you didn't do that. Just the case seems to be there's honey coming out. Now that you crushed, right, the wax of the honeycomb, you crushed it, so there's honey coming out on Shabbat. But we're going to allow you, Rabbi Elazar says he allows you to use that honey. Because that honey, we're not afraid. What are you afraid? You might come to squeeze it. Even if you would squeeze it, you would not be violating the Torah prohibition because it's already at a stage of food once it was already crushed. So that's what the Gemara wants to say. And therefore you can't compare it to the case of the olive and the grape, because even when you crushed it once, the liquid that's still contained inside the grape that was crushed is not a food. It's not distinct. And maybe if you would crush it again, squeeze it again, maybe it would be a biblical prohibition. And therefore, we had to bring an opinion, Rabbi Yishmael, that says it's not a biblical prohibition. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar, Amalach. Rabbi Elazar says, how is he going to defend himself? How is he bringing his proof from bringing the case of the honeycomb when the honeycomb maybe is different because it's food once it was crushed the first time, after it was crushed the first time, and after it would be crushed the second time, it's food to food. It's no real big change to say that it's the act of threshing. In contrast to an olive or a grape that was crushed once, if you crush it again, it is something, it's a real big change. Because even though you crush the olive or grape once, but the subsequent juice is still inside, it's still part of the olive and the grape. It doesn't have its own identity. It's still considered a food, part of a food. And then you squeeze it a second time, you're turning into a liquid. Maybe there'll be a biblical prohibition. So the Gemara says he's not worried about that. You can't use that. He doesn't have that as a concern for him. Why? Because Hashemina le Rabbi Elazar, we know that the same author by the honeycomb that says you could use the honey that comes out of the honey that's oozing out after you crushed it before Shabbat, then it's subsequently oozed out on Shabbat, you could use it. Hashemina le Rabbi Elazar dafilu zeitim v'anovim nami shari, that even olives and grapes would be the same law. So you're asking, what was the Gemara's question? The Gemara's question was, how could you go ahead and bring a proof from the case of the honeycomb? Maybe the honeycomb is different, right? Maybe it's different than olives and grapes. I mean, you're saying the author of the Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar. And you found that he said by the honeycomb, so therefore you're saying it's the same law by the olives and the grapes. And then you come back and you say, no, how could you prove it from the honeycomb case? Maybe only Rabbi Elazar says it by the honeycomb case, but the honeycomb was originally a food. After you crushed it the first time, it has the status of a food, and the subsequent crushing of it is also considered a food. And therefore, maybe that's why it wouldn't be a biblical prohibition for the second crushing. However, in the Mishnah, when it's an olive and a grape, maybe after you crush it the first time, and then if you crush it the second time, you're really accomplishing something, the second crushing, because you're turning it from a food into a liquid. So maybe there would be a biblical prohibition, even though it was crushed once. Correct, Levi? So the Gemara says, I find that Rabbi Elazar holds there's no distinction between a honeycomb and olive and grape. And therefore, the Amora, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, had a right to say that the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua, because Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua went on record equally by olives and grapes that were crushed once, just like he says by the honeycomb. And therefore, there is no distinction between the honeycomb and the olive and the grape according to the Rabbi Elazar, and therefore it's a good match for our Mishnah by the grapes and the olives. Hashem, the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar Malach, Hashem Mina Leila Rabbi Elazar, that filu zaitim v'anav namisari. We heard somewhere else, not from a Mishnah, but from a Braita, that he holds that even olives and grapes are also permitted if they were crushed before Shabbat, and then subsequently liquid came out of the olive and the grape on Shabbat, right? We go ahead and this Rabbi Elazar says you could use the olive and the liquid the grape, the juice that came out from the olive and the liquid on Shabbat. If it was crushed once before Shabbat, you can use the liquid. Why? Because once it was crushed once, it's not subject to the malacha, the act of threshing, of crushing, of if it would be done a second time on Shabbat. So therefore, the rabbis don't need to create a fence for the liquid that comes out on Shabbat. When do the rabbis have to create a fence for the liquid that comes out of Shabbat from olives and grapes? Those were olives and grapes that were not crushed before Shabbat. So if you're going to come to drink the juice of the olive and the grape that comes out on Shabbat, you might come to squeeze the olive and the grape on Shabbat. And squeezing an olive and grape on Shabbat is a biblical prohibition of shchita, which is a derivative of dash, of threshing. However, but once you crushed it before Shabbat, even if you would use the juice on Shabbat, what are you afraid of? They might come to squeeze it. Even if you would squeeze it, it will not be a biblical prohibition because it was already crushed before. So that's the culture of Elazar. Also, Rabbi Yoshia Menada, when Rabbi Yoshia came from Nada, he came and he brought a brisa with him. You know, people go traveling and they bring back souvenirs, right, Mr. Haber? They bring a souvenir. People come to New York, they bring a souvenir, a shirt that's I love New York, a hat, I love New York. So very good. But what did he bring back? Right. It's duty free, no tax, right? No tax, and it's the best thing. That's what he brings. That's what we go on a vacation, supposed to go to the rabbis in the town, pick up something, right, Jack, and bring it back with us, right? This is what he brought back when he came from the Hadah, one of the great citadels of Torah. So he brought back the following. This was what he brought back. Zaitim v'anavim sherizkan me'erev Shabbat. Olives, grapes that were crushed before Shabbat, and then v'yatzu ma'atzman. And then some liquid came out on its own on Shabbat. Not that you re-squeeze them on Shabbat. The liquid came out on its own on Shabbat. These were crushed before Shabbat. So the first opinion in the Braita says asurin. You can't use that liquid. However, Rabbi Elazar, Ben Shamua, and Rabbi Shimon matirin. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shamua, and Rabbi Shimon, they permitted this liquid since it was already crushed before Shabbat. So, being that's the case, we find that Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua holds, so we found that there's no difference between a honeycomb, between olives and grapes. Once it was crushed before Shabbat, subsequent crushing would not be a violation of the malacha of threshing, since even without your action, the liquid is coming out on its own because of the first crushing, and your if making it faster would not be a biblical prohibition. So the Gemara now is back to the drawing board. Being that's the case, so why didn't Rabbi Yosef Bechanina say that the Tana of our Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua? Because we have a Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua, which we said is not a great proof, because maybe the Mishnah is talking about a honeycomb, But then we found Rabbi Elazar, we have a breakdown that says, Rabbi Elazar Shemua says that even a olive grape, once it's been crushed once, there's no concern the second time on a Torah level. So the Gemara says, he did not know that this breita, meaning all the Tanaim, or really even the Amora, all the Amoraim knew all the Mishnayot, the Mishnah, but not all the Braitos. The Braitos, all the Braitos, not everyone knew all of them, not everyone heard all of them, not everyone accepted all of them. And therefore, the Braitos were not as frequently known as everyone did not know it. Many Amoraim did not know all the Braitos. Being that's the case, that's why he could not say that the opinion of the Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua, because he only knew Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua's case of the honeycomb. The honeycomb, he felt, is not a comparable case to the olive and the grape, and therefore he had to come on to the other Mishnah by the garlic and the unripe grapes, where we had Rabbi Yishmael, and therefore he said that the Tana, the author of our Mishnah, is Rabbi Yishmael. To be continued, Bez Hashem, after Yom Tov. I want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach, a very joyous holiday. And remember, we have to make sure that the poor people also have for the holiday. The big part of the mitzvah is that you have to be happy, your family members have to be happy, and the poor people have to be happy. Have a great day. It should be a very joyous
Thank you,
holiday.
Rabbi. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom.
You too, and I will be back.
Chag Sameach.
You too, everybody. I'll be back on Wednesday, Bezat Hashem Yisbarach. All the best.
Thank you, Rabbi. All the best.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. All the best.